In 1250 BCE, the Bronze Age Mediterranean was in a golden age of prosperity and power. It was known as the Age of Empires, with all of these people interconnected in the world's first truly global trade network. They had wide areas of influence, with strong militaries and a centralized bureaucracy. But by 1100 BCE, all of this was gone. What happened to it? Why did they all collapse? And who or what was responsible? Hi everyone, this is Travels with an Archaeologist. I'm the Archaeologist, now let's get into the travels. In this episode, I want to discuss the Bronze Age collapse. And this is particularly interesting because this is one of the biggest unsolved mysteries in archaeology. And a legitimate mystery too, not like one of those crazy ones that get tossed around the internet all the time. So what is the Bronze Age collapse? Well, it is what it sounds like. The Bronze Age just collapsed. With the exception of Egypt, all these empires and cultures disappeared. And even in Egypt, their once vast empire shrank to their core heartlands, and it entered a period of political weakness. To add to the mystery, around this time, many of these empires do contain an unusually high number of cities that show signs of destruction. What's more, this began a dark age, so written records also became scarce in some areas and disappeared completely in others. So what happened to cause such a widespread societal collapse? Well, that is the mystery. Naturally, there are some theories. One such theory is that technological advancement led one of these empires to be able to militarily outcompete the other. This is based on the fact that iron did indeed replace bronze as the metal of choice when the period of collapse ended, but honestly, this is a bit of an outdated theory. For one thing, iron was already in use in the Bronze Age. The transition from bronze to iron is not a clear-cut line, just as the transition from swords to gunpowder is not a clear-cut line. Finally, if they were technologically outmatched, why did all of them collapse? At least one of them should have grown bigger than the other. More commonly accepted theories include the usual suspects of widespread famine, drought, disease, earthquakes, or even climate change. But the two most commonly given reasons are internal instability combined with the collapse of globalized trade networks. So if you've seen my Minoan, Mycenaean, and Indus Valley videos, you'll have an idea of just how wide these trade routes were, and if you've watched my roads video, you'll know that studying them was the subject of my dissertation. And I chose it because it is just so fascinating. This was the most global trade network the world had ever seen and would ever see until the age of mercantilism. And these routes were important. Everyone was trading with everyone else, and this trade was constant, rich, and intertwined in everybody's system, from the Alps to the Indus. Armies, taxation, and administration, of course, had their place in this world, but all wealth flowed through trade in this era. It was absolutely central to the economy, to the point where the fortunes of one state affected the fortunes of all of them. Now, if this sounds familiar, that's probably because we in the modern world are also linked in this way. But it's actually not a common occurrence in human history to have international trade be so tightly intertwined with the state's politics, diplomacy, and economic prosperity to the point where the fortunes of one will affect them all. This is one reason why understanding the Bronze Age collapse is crucial to understanding how our own systems work and how a collapse could be either averted or how it would look if it did happen. With the economies so intertwined to each other, the collapse of these trade routes was not something everybody suddenly decided on. This wasn't a case of trade barriers suddenly popping up and states retreating into themselves. This had to be the result of other forms of collapse from within, and the cause most often cited has been civil unrest and foreign invasion. And if you've heard anything at all about the Bronze Age collapse before this video, you've probably also heard it in relation to the Sea Peoples. Specifically, you might have even heard that they were responsible for it. So who were the Sea People, and where did they come from? Officially, Sea Peoples were biblical Philistines. But given that the Sea Peoples settled there and became Philistines, all this does is punt the question one tier down. Who were the Philistines, and where did they come from? And again, we don't know. There are theories, but it is contentious. I actually do have my own academic opinion on this, one that I am going to share and one that other academics share, but it is just an opinion. I don't want there to be an illusion that I'm presenting this as an established fact. As many experts do hold this opinion, I feel on pretty solid ground, but there's a lot of experts who don't share this opinion, and it does create a passionate debate even among the most experienced of us. So with that disclaimer out of the way, who do I believe the Sea Peoples to be as somebody who has researched this area and time period in great depth? Well, I believe that they were Mycenaeans. This is by no means a settled question in archaeology, but having studied both Mycenaeans and the Philistines, the only colony we know for sure the Sea Peoples established and held, it seems clear to me that there is an undeniable connection. So why do I and other academics think this? Well, it's because their pottery shows a clear, distinct relationship, as does their architecture and what little we know of their non-religious cultural practices. Mycenaean Phase 3C-1b pottery is indistinguishable from Philistine Phase 1, with the styles from Philistia being produced locally in a style that was invented on Mycenaean Cyprus. Speaking of which, Mycenaeans first arrived on Cyprus during the collapse, which means that they were obviously moving in this time. And yes, the people who arrived on Cyprus were definitely Mycenaean. There is no archaeological question on that one. Later accounts of the destruction of Troy also come from this era. In addition, the Philistines seem to speak an Indo-European language like Greek, rather than a Semitic language like the Phoenicians or the Hebrews. Of course, this theory does have holes. Indo-European languages existed in more areas than just the Aegean. The Hittites, in fact, have the oldest surviving Indo-European script, and they are one of the victims of the collapse. Another theory links the Sea Peoples to the Etruscans, who would have also spoken an Indo-European language. Also, copying a ceramic art style does not equate to being the same culture, and at any rate, we do see material differences. This is a Philistine coffin, a far cry from the grand elite tombs of the Mycenaeans, and incidentally, these coffins are part of how we connect the Philistines to the Sea People. The headdresses on the coffins match those that the Egyptians depict the Sea Peoples with. And some Philistine burials actually did match the Mycenaean ones in miniature. But their gods were not the Greek ones. Philistine gods included Baal, Astarte, and Asherah, all Phoenician and Eastern deities. While this could easily be a case of them adopting local religions, it does poke a major hole in the theory given that we know the Mycenaeans worshipped the Greek pantheon. And some Egyptian records seem to hint at an origin in a land of Lucca, taken to be Lycia, and are mentioned as allies of the Hittites. This would be problematic for the theory if the records are true, given that the Hittites and Mycenaeans had a massive rivalry, closing off each other's land to each other's trade. Sea Peoples are also mentioned in connection with the Shurdan pirates, which means that they would hold a connection to Sardinia, though the Shurdan are depicted differently in Egyptian art. It might be then that there is no one solid answer. Just as Caribbean pirates did not hail from one specific culture, it might be the same story with Sea People. Still, there is no denying that Philistine archaeology looks astonishingly Aegean on closer look. But it's not exclusively Aegean, either. Even so, I believe that these differences can be explained away if we take the Sea Peoples as middle-class Mycenaeans or even Minoans who rebelled against Mycenaean control. After all, the elites of Mycenaean society would have been well shielded from the worst effects of the famine, total warfare, or overpopulation. Meanwhile, the middle and merchant classes would have been ideally positioned to start a new life under less oppressive conditions. They may have also joined up with the Shurdan pirates, or there may have been more than one group of Sea Peoples. Of course, there's still the question as to why they would be on the move, but this is a question we would face no matter who the Sea Peoples were. What we can say for sure is that Sea Peoples were definitely foreigners with a likely Western origin, but from where in the West is hotly debated. One thing is for certain, they were brutal fighters, acknowledged by many sources to have very good quality weapons and smithies. And their emergence is often synonymous with the Bronze Age collapse, and speaking of one requires a discussion of the other. But did the Sea Peoples deserve their reputation as a driver of the Bronze Age collapse? It isn't certain, and to be honest, the theory that they are is a bit outdated and, in my opinion, lacking in nuance. The Sea Peoples are better thought of as a symptom of the collapse, not the cause of it. For one thing, Sea People appear in records earlier than the Bronze Age collapse, and they're mentioned by Ramses the Great, who hired them as mercenaries. In addition, they were not the only group raiding. And for proof, let's turn to the Bible. Yeah, I'm serious. The Hebrew were raiding the countryside, burning cities as described in the book of Judges. This account of Judges is usually dated to the period of the collapse and, if true, actually shows some really exciting corroborations with archaeology and extra-biblical sources. What we read in the book of Judges is a memory of this time period from the perspective of the Hebrews, a time when Egypt had surrendered authority and new smaller states were forming out of the splinters of larger empires. And the fact that it lines up with the settlement of the Sea People in the archaeological record is undeniably awesome. And if there's any skepticism of the date of these accounts, there are mentions of these raids from other sources as well. Letters to the Egyptian court of this time from regional governors, particularly those of the Levant, speak of several groups of raiders along the countryside, among them a group of people they call the Apiru. And here's another takeaway. These are not the only invasions we know about. In the Bible alone, invasions by Edomites, Ammonites, and Arameans are also mentioned. And going to extra-biblical sources, we see Middle Assyrians battling widespread revolt in their own empire. The Kassites are dealing with Elamite invasions from the east, and the Egyptians were dealing with both a civil war and rising discontent from the occupied Nubian regions. Mycenaean, Hittite, and Mitanni cities haven't left any records of who sacked them, but archaeology shows definite evidence of widespread destruction there too. So with all these people moving around and rebelling, why do the Sea Peoples get the blame? Well, they were certainly by far the most fearsome of the raiders. We know for a fact that they caused the fall of Ugarit and Kadesh, and Ramses III made a very big deal of how he won a great victory over the Sea People in his own reign. Following his defeat, he actually granted them land in the Levant to settle, and it was this group that became the Philistines. Now, I will say there is some dispute to this particular element of the story, especially if the timelines line up. Some say that they actually did gain a victory over Ramses III and it was the Levant they settled in, but let's move past this. It's not entirely relevant for us right now. Sea People raids were also very widespread. We know that the Sea Peoples landed at 6 locations across the Mediterranean and likely more that go undocumented. And because they came out of nowhere and caused such significant damage, it is tempting to think that they had something to do with the collapse. And while there is no doubt that they exacerbated the issue, I also believe that the evidence is clear that a lot of people were moving and revolting at this time, and there were hundreds of violent clashes. The Sea People might have been the most fearsome of them, but they weren't the only ones. In other words, something was causing these people to move. It was not this movement of people that caused the collapse. So what was causing these movements? Well, here again, I turn to the usual suspects of drought, famine, or some other natural disaster that threw a wrench into the trade routes and caused a domino effect. Because if one place experiences a drought or a famine, that means they have to allocate more resources to their own lands, which means fewer resources to trade, which means less trade, and this exacerbates the issue all along the line. We've seen this in our own era. Remember a couple of years ago when that ship blocked the Suez Canal? That had a measurable economic impact, and that was just 6 days, and all it did was divert other ships to go the long way around Africa. Imagine now if there was enough instability that this continued for 100 years. And this collapse did take place over about 100 years. It looks sudden on the archaeological record, but there has been almost as much time between the release of this video and World War I as there was from the beginning to the end of the Bronze Age collapse. At least as far as we consider the Bronze Age collapse to have a proper beginning and a proper end. It's more than possible that a dozen different things happened over decades that led to instability in one area, which in turn would have driven it in another, and so on. And hard times for one area would lead to hard times for another. And yes, records from these areas from before the collapse do speak of them approaching hard times, but it's not clear, again, whether this hard time was caused by the collapse of the trade routes, or whether this was the first domino to fall. But we do know that these empires fell. And after they did, there was a dark age that lasted for over a century. And the Iron Age world that emerged was ironically much smaller and more diverse, with less centralized empires that did not rely on trade in quite the same way. Theirs was an era of growth in a domestic economy, with many locally minded smaller states instead of globally minded empires, at least for the next few hundred years. So there you have it. That is the Bronze Age collapse and the Sea Peoples in a very quick nutshell. It is a complicated topic, one of the most complicated in archaeology, in fact, but it is also one of the most fascinating. And I hope that you found it fascinating too. If you did, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. And until next time, I'm the Archaeologist, and this has been The Travels.